this as a link. So we're now recording this. If this is something you want, what we will do is we'll follow up this and we'll send out the slides, and we'll also send out a link to the recording. One of the other things just to mention, and we'll drop it in here, is I've got lots of resources on this topic. So if you wanted to revisit it and you don't necessarily want to watch it as a webinar, I've got quite a lot of content sitting in the HR Uprising podcast that I host, and we'll drop the link in if those of you, if you're not familiar with that, we'll drop a link in there so you can get more information there. Rosie, it is. We've just been having the conversation. We are all freezing wherever we are today. So some of you know Actus because actually you're our customers, but a lot of you don't necessarily. So let me just briefly introduce Actus. So Actus is our complete performance learning and compliance management suite. I'm popping that up there because we offer compliance solutions to financial services sector. And if there is anybody here from financial services and HR, particularly if you're involved in the consumer duty, maybe message us separately because we've got a new product coming through that's available in that area. But our bread and butter is performance management, hence we know a lot about this, and I'm going to be sharing some research that we've done in this area and some practicalities as to how you can embed this continuous performance management within your organisations. So what we're going to look at is, what's the issue with annual appraisal? Is it an issue, or, do people being unfair on the annual appraisal? Thinking about the purpose, if you want to adjust or freshen up appraisal in your organisation, we'll consider what the purpose is, because that will give you a steer as to the best way to do it. We're talking about performance management, lining it with your culture, the style of performance management. I mentioned evidence and just practicals. I'm going to take you through a practical way in which you could embed a continuous performance management process in your organisation. So in terms of people's issues with appraisal, I'm just looking down. Thank you for saying hi, people there. Let's say from Jess from Wakefield, you can see here. In terms of appraisal in your organisation, in fact, I'm going to pop a poll up, in fact, and find out what your view is in terms of what's going on for you. So in your own organisation, or if you're an external where you're working, are you doing appraisals? What's the situation? Is it an established annual process? Is it something that, happens, it's supported by regular one-to-ones? Have you ditched it and you are just doing ongoing check-ins? And if you are, interesting to know, is that working for you? Yes, or you want to change to something. So maybe you're doing appraisal, but actually you want to change it. So let's know what this is. And I've actually got a screenshot later of when I've done this as a previous, and we'll see whether anything's changed in terms of this. So I'll just let you go through this. Is 63%. So if anyone else wants to just respond on this, and we'll let you know, give you a feel for what everybody else is doing. And let me just check. So we've got lots of head of HRs, HR. So most people, HR, OD, L&D makes sense. So responsibility for this. Anyone else want to respond? 70% participation. I was going to go on 3. I'll count down from 3 to give you a chance just to do this, and then I'll share the poll. 3, 2, 1, and end poll. That's interesting, actually. The results are really similar to the last time we did it. So what we're saying is actually the majority of people are still doing it either as an annual process. Yes, if it's with regular one-to-ones. Some of you have ditched it for ongoing check-ins. Really interested if you have done that, i.e. you're not pulling the check-ins together and it's not resulting in you don't have an appraisal at all. Is that what you're saying? Those of you who've said that, interested to know if that's working for you. Would love to put that in the chat if that is the case. And is it working, or are there challenges? Yes, but you're hoping to change. So that's what people have responded in terms of this group here. And Nick, I recognised your name. I was wondering where you were. So up in Scotland, yes. Right. So let me close this down and we'll get on with the content of it. So let's see, what issues have you got, or if you're using continuous performance, continuous conversations, tell us in that chat. I'll just prompt myself to slow down. I thought I'd try not to speak too quickly. I get overexcited. So what do people, why is it that people have sort of said, we don't want appraisals? Why does it get maligned, if you like? Well, the complaints that you typically hear are people say it's too backwards looking. So if it's, especially if you call it a review, so they often feel that it's looking backwards, but it's not actually focused enough on the future. So people find it a bit out of date almost. Sometimes people feel that because it doesn't culminate anything, if maybe it's not linked to pay or talent management, then sometimes people think, what's the point of it? Usually the biggest complaint, and if you look at, I remember some research, it was actually in the NHS done by the King's Fund, is about how it's done. The biggest complaint about appraisal is not the actual process or activities, it's the way in which it's delivered, or the manager. And they found evidence in terms of employee engagement that it was better to have no appraisal in terms of employee engagement than a bad appraisal, as in, I'm not saying bad, saying bad things, where the manager was clearly disinterested in terms of it. So bad management is usually the issue. And the other one is maybe it's feeling disjointed, so it's not relevant to your day to day. It's just sort of looking at something, objectives, but it's not linked to your day to day. So, oh, thank you, Jess, for commenting. I'm going to look at that in a moment. That's really useful to see what you've got there. And so this is the evidence that I was saying there in terms of this. A bad appraisal is actually worse than no appraisal when it comes down to employee engagement. So one of the takeaways is whatever you're choosing to do, the most important thing is making sure it's a quality conversation. And that's making sure that your line managers understand why they're doing it. This is about employee engagement, it's about focusing people. But ultimately, the issue really is less about the process, which means that you can choose whichever way you want in many ways, and more about the way in which it's delivered. So let's remember that whatever we're talking about here, we need to make sure that our line managers are making it meaningful. But is moving to a culture of regular check-ins instead of ditching appraisals altogether, is that the answer? Well, that's interesting here. Let's say monthly personal review based on principles. So you're saying measure what matters, record what matters, talk when it matters, ambition matters. That's your mantra there, Jess, in your organisation. So just interesting, if you're doing that, is there anything you're losing by having the monthly thing? Because one of the things that that I've heard before with this is actually, how do you make it happen? How do you track it? And actually, again, this comes down to whether or not your line managers are invested in it. They see the purpose of it. The other potential issue is whether or not you've got enough in terms of goals and feedback. So what we're talking about here is making sure that people are giving regular feedback, because if we want to actually drive high performance, which, let's face it, we're all in organizations or businesses, so performance matters, then we need to remember that continuous check-ins are fine, but if they're just tactical conversations, which is one of the criticisms of a one-to-one, if it is just literally, so what are you up to, what you're doing, if you're just thinking tactically from 1 week to the next or 1 month to the next, are we connecting with the bigger organizational purpose? Are we agreeing goals with people? And are we giving specific feedback in line with performance against those goals? So it can almost become a little bit too micro looking down. So logically, getting a balance between the two is going to be a good thing, because what you want to do is make sure that having goals and regular feedback, which absolutely fits within a one-to-one, if it's done well, is going to be your optimum, you think, in many ways. Now, the interesting thing is, as this is almost exactly the same. A few more have got yesterday's annual process. This was when I did this on the previous webinar, as I've run a similar one previously, and you can see actually you've got many of you are doing this, an appraisal supported by regular one-to-ones. Now, within this webinar, I am going to share with you a way in which you can break your appraisal out if you want to, which could give you even more of a focus of ongoing conversations. So one of the challenges of moving to just check-ins, and again, Jess, interesting to know whether whether you found a solution for this, if this is working for you, is, do you know if they're actually going to happen? Of course, I'm going to say, if you have a system like Actus, you can track those regular one-to-ones, so you would be able to report and see they're happening. But if you haven't got systems, do you know if they're going to happen or not? You also can't necessarily tell the quality of the interaction. And I think arguably you could say the same about that with appraisals, but to an extent, if you are using systems, or you could view the content or the quality of the narrative that's written within it. But you want those interactions to be quality regardless. Is there an absence of goal setting, as per my previous point, which goal setting is really, really important. Goal setting and feedback is so important from a point of view of performance. Does it become tactical and lack alignment? If you are linking something to reward or talent, how do you do that with an ongoing process? So that also can be a bit tricky. You haven't got a kind of culmination point when you think, right, now we're going to do our succession planning activities, or now we're going to allocate pay and reward if that's something that happens. So those can be the things that if you just have check-ins that, HR go, these are now one of the reasons for doing the appraisal. This makes it quite tricky because we haven't got that culmination point. So those are the challenges, not saying it's horses for courses in terms of working what the right thing to do is, but it is always useful to go back to the research. This is some research. We commissioned a research review with a psychologist a few years ago. It's still relevant because they looked at the last 50 years worth of research. But the key things that came out, I've mentioned one of them, clear objectives and regular feedback is a really key area in terms of driving performance. So you need to maintain that really if a performance-led culture. Ratings. Ratings are an interesting one. Some people love them, some people hate them. They can be useful for reward, but what some evidence the CIPD found was that performance ratings are different from development ratings. And what I mean by that is they found that people's levels of honesty about rating others, peer-to-peer rating, was different based on how they perceived that rating was going to be used. So if they thought that this rating was actually about, let's say, a 360 feedback where it's all just about someone getting better self-awareness, it isn't going to have any knock-on on their career. So there's high trust that you can be honest in that, then people would be honest about how they perceived others' performance or behaviour in that developmental context. But if they thought that their rating was going to affect someone's salary or bonus, then they were less honest. So they would be more inclined to sort of uprate somebody. So there is a difference if you're using ratings as to how people perceive those ratings are going to be used. And as I say, manager more feedback, they're more honest when they're looking at developmental feedback rather than performance ratings. So therefore, and this is when I go into this model that we've used, actually a lot of our customers have moved to, it's a sort of year-round model of breaking out your appraisal is it better therefore to split out development conversations from performance conversations? And I think this also links into, I remember the longest appraisal form that I ever came across was in the NHS, and it was 10 pages. And you can understand why a manager and the individual, in fact, is going to lose the will to live on a 10-page appraisal, and they're only going to want to use it once a year. And so it's going to feel a bit like going through the motions. And the reason it was 10 pages is so much detail, but also trying to cover a lot of things. They were trying to cover, performance against objectives for sure, key successes and challenges, performance against values or competencies, learning and development needs, had they done the statutory learning and development, and also career questions and those sort of things. So all of those are trying to be covered in one conversation, which you think about it, actually, they're quite difficult to meld together anyway, because if you haven't had a great year from a performance point of view, do you really want to talk about career? Those can feel difficult in that same conversation. So I'll propose a way that we recommend of splitting it out. But those, again, are challenges in terms of your annual appraisal, is when you're trying to do an awful lot in one conversation. Great. Jess, thank you for this extra thing. So Jess, you found that so you're finding those are more meaningful than where you've worked before, where people were being tick box. And you've also got long-term goal setting. Great. Okay, so that's great, Jess. So you are still doing the goal setting, which is really important, and people seem to be having more meaningful conversations. So it sounds like it's working to a degree, but whether you can see it happening is, so it may be as pockets. There isn't a perfect solution, but that's really helpful of you to share. Thank you. So in terms of this, what we need to do is we need to think, if you're thinking what's the right solution for your organisation, and we've got, a number of people on this, 30, 40 people on this call, what's the right solution for you? Then thinking about what's the organisational context. And so we work with public sector organisations, NHS organisations, and private sector organisations. So depending on your environment, that is relevant if you're thinking about where you are currently and where you want to go to. So ask yourself, what's the current situation within your organisation if you're wanting to change appraisal, and what is it that's making you want to change it? So is it that people are not adhering to it? Is it too clunky? Is it just time for a change? Do you want to allocate reward better? Do you want to motivate people? Do you want to create a high performance culture? What's the reason that you want to change things? And do you have something in place already? Whether it's on paper or online or a system, because you can reconfigure systems, you can adjust them, you can relabel them and rebrand systems or paper. So whatever you've got, do you have something in place that you want to adjust? And think about what it is you want to change about it. Ultimately, just be really clear on what the problem is that you want to fix by making a change to your process. And it is interesting, again, is make sure that it actually is a problem with the process and not a problem with the way in which that process is being delivered, i.e. your line managers aren't doing it, or they're not doing it in a meaningful way, because that is a different solution in terms of education, training, cultural change than just the actual system or process that you're running. And then I think about what is the main purpose of your process. And that is relevant because you need to think of that in terms of how you're going to set the tone and the cadence of your process. So if is your main purpose to drive high performance in your organization? Is it about alignment of reward? And obviously it could be more than one of these. Is it about employee engagement? Because in actual fact, your public sector, you can't control reward, let's say, or it's not linked to appraisal. Or is it about retention, development, and career opportunities? You might say it's all of those, but I mean, there's different tones based on what it is. So, for example, if it is about high performance, then you might want to, you want to make sure that you've got really good quality, smart goals in there, and making sure that managers are regularly feeding back on that in terms of clear conversations around those objectives need to be aligned with the business. They need to be stretching. They need to be taking people in the right direction. So they need to be meaningful and need to be supported up. So that goal is going to be quite key. And with that, if you are aligning reward, then you need to make sure that your performance is fair. So by the way, if any of you are putting in things like ratings, we've got lots of white papers you can access in terms of things like this as well. So if you want to align reward, you probably are going to have to put some sort of rating in place, but you need to make sure that people therefore are administering those ratings in a fair and objective way. That goes back to having smart objectives as opposed to just tactical objectives. And you want to probably put in place something like a moderation or a calibration process, which is looking at whether or not managers are applying the reward appropriately. Now, the flip side of it, if it has nothing to do with money, then actually the real goal is about engagement, then you need to make sure it's not too detailed, right? The questions need to be appreciative type questions. Think about the tone of things, the way in which questions are worded. So it might be, what your key achievements are, what are you most proud of, those sort of things. So it's very much a sort of appreciative inquiry type questions. Make sure the tone is there. And similar with retention, but making sure that there's an angle in terms of where do you want to go, your aspirations, so you have more of a focus. And I suppose I'm saying you'd have more free text, so it's lighter touch in terms of open questions, which is sending the sign to your line managers, put the focus and the time into the conversation there. Interestingly, also, if you do something like ratings or appraisals, actually just think about the language. So I've seen things like people saying not achieved or okay, really kind of negative terms. With ratings, you want to encourage managers to be honest. So I prefer to see something like partially achieved. So somebody who hasn't actually achieved what they've partially achieved sounds much better than not achieved or underachieved, right? So partially achieved, overachieved. So having positive language is useful, and actually I quite like the word achieve. One of our customers doesn't call it an appraisal, they call it achievement, an achievement review, which is quite nice. Again, it's quite positive in terms of what they're talking about. Choose your language. I mean, review, some people don't love the term review, so think about what things are called, and sometimes just a bit of a rebrand can freshen it up and send a slightly different tone or message as to what it's all about. So think about what the purpose of your process is and make sure that what you're expecting people to do and the language of your forms aligns with that purpose, if you like, and is supportive of it as opposed to anything else. And actually, Out of interest, what do you call your process? Have you got things, are they called achievement? Is it called appraisals, or has anyone got an exciting brand that they're using within their organization? Do let us know in the chat what you call it. Is it performance management process, PRP, all those things? We've all got the acronyms. Love to hear what you're calling it. So the thing to bear in mind though is whatever you are doing, you are going to have an impact based on the culture. And that's going to make the difference to the success of any process. So you need to be clear that your leaders of the organisation buy into the fact that it's a quality process, and they need to model that behaviour from the top in order to make sure they're. So lead by example in terms of it. Thanks, Rachel. Review conversations, two-way dialogue. So conversation, you're using the word conversation as part of it. Nice. And I'm going to go on and share this model that works for quite a lot of our customers, where they're going, actually, we want to still have a appraisal process, but I'm going to break it up to more continuous conversations. And again, this is something that it is horses for courses in terms of what's appropriate for your organization. Some organizations can support weekly one-to-ones, but a lot, you're lucky to get people to go quarterly. So thinking about what is the right cadence or frequency of activities through your organisation, but be really clear about what the expectations are. If you're trying to achieve culture change, you can say go off and do continuous conversations. But the reality is, will anything happen unless you're quite clear about it? And just an annual, having just one touch point, an annual review, you can make that happen because you can see whether it happens or not. But it's very hard to track whether those continuous quality conversations are going on unless you formalize it in some way. And this is a way in which you could do it. So I call this my clock face. And I think about, at the start of your business year, and most businesses do now align with business year. Some that we work with don't, but it's quite hard if you have a rolling, they do appraisals on their start date anniversary, which is really quite hard to track and to manage from an HR point of view. Also, it takes it away from a focus on performance, in my opinion. So by aligning with your organisational business year, you're clearly signposting that your personal objectives are about helping the business to perform. So they should be aligned with the overall business objectives. Now, again, this is a key challenge that a lot of us have, is making sure that the overall business goals are sufficiently visible, that people know what the business is trying to achieve so that they can align with it. And sometimes that's a leadership thing where people need a nudge. So we've started our year, we've set our SMART objectives, and by SMART, I'm talking about specific and stretching. So they're aligned from a relevant point of view, they have measures in them, and they are outcomes. The numbers of businesses that I work with where people have got objectives which are just process objectives, they're not clear outcomes. That is really tricky if you want to allocate reward, because if people have just got an objective which is kind of about their day job, there's no sort of stretch on the day job, and it's not a clear outcome, it's more of a doing objective, it's very hard to evaluate it. So most people, although they've heard of SMART, they find it very hard to write truly SMART objectives. So you may want to start there with educating your managers in that. And again, we've got lots of resources on that, and we do training regularly with organisations on that topic. But then the idea here is that if you want to break up your 10-page, hopefully you haven't got a 10-page appraisal, into smaller chunks, it's quite logical to think about development next. My background was learning and development, as I said at the start, and I used to think when I'm talking 20 years ago, we had an annual appraisal process, and I had to wait until the end of the annual appraisal to then get this list of development needs that people had. It's kind of a shopping list. And I was thinking, well, what's really the point? Because the business year's over, they've been evaluated. It's kind of what training do you want? Which doesn't really make that much sense when you think actually development should be about supporting your performance or your career aspirations, right? So it's really logical. We get to the end of Q1, have a brief conversation with the individual. How are you doing against your objectives? And is there any development that you need to support you in performing this year? Right, so how do we help you to do this? So you can identify any aligned development, and ideally, if you're the L&D person, you get that feedback. Obviously, if you have a system, then it's quite easy because you can pull those real-time development needs. And that allows you to ideally fulfill that development within the first half of that year. Now, the benefit, in my view, is that that means that person's getting the development that they require is going to help them to achieve. So it's a logic for talking about it earlier rather than later, when it's just a have some training for next year sort of thing. So we would say do a development review at the end of Q1. We'd then say if you are, it's actually good practice to have a mid-year appraisal. It could be a little bit lighter touch than your overall one. But if you are doing something like performance-related pay, then I think it's really important to have a 6-month appraisal. And the reason I think it's key there is that's an opportunity to check in and let that person know whether you think they're on track or not. You don't want someone to get to the end of the year surprise when they're told that actually they're not achieving. You want people to be performing, and it's maybe an opportunity for a bit of a kick up the backside to get people to refocus their performance. So it's really useful time. The other thing I believe is that you could talk about behaviours at this, make it more behavioural. So is that person meeting the values? Are they meeting the competencies? So you've got a bit of time to have a quality conversation about how people are operating within the business. And again, that's building your culture. Then we go into our end of third quarter. And for me, this is a logic to talk about talent and career conversations at this point, because talent and career conversations, for me, it's about retaining people. It's keeping them motivated. So let's say you've got a high performer and they're thinking, okay, I'm looking all right for this year, or I'm getting a bit bored, I might start looking around. Well, actually, let's focus them on, what they want to do. So you're having a dedicated conversation about this, as opposed to it being a sort of adjunct to a really long appraisal conversation and everybody's running out of steam and it's like, oh, okay, what do you want? So really, this is more of an engagement conversation. Thinking, what are your aspirations overall? Where do you want to go? What can we do about this? And you might look at objectives and development again here, but it's a nice little touch point. And then finally, you get to the end of the year. And because you've been having those conversations all year round, it doesn't have to be a 3-hour epic, but you can have a quality conversation about what did we achieve. Hopefully it's not a painful tick box because you've been talking about performance on an ongoing basis, and you can focus on achievement and the future. So with those, effectively what we're saying is you've broken your classic annual appraisal down into 4 touch points. The obvious argument from line managers is, I haven't got time to do that. But really, we're not saying spend any more time. We're saying break something down that can feel a bit lengthy into 4 shorter conversations, but they're more meaningful. So it works for engagement. It works for focusing performance. Remember the evidence about goals. So you're still keeping that focus on goals and performance. And then tactical conversations around, day-to-day stuff. They're your one-to-ones, so they can fit in around the edges. So that's an approach that works really well for a number of people that we work with. The key summary points that I'd make, and if anyone's got any questions, this is my last main slide, do feel free to pop them into the chat. The key points is that what you want to do is, if you're doing development, link it to achievement of objective skills or competencies, in my view. Make it relevant as opposed to a just tick box. I appreciate things like compliance are more difficult in that. Talk early in the year and have ongoing conversations. That's the key. Educate your managers to do that. If possible, if you've got real-time visibility, that's going to make it much easier for you in your L&D roles, as many of you have got, or HR roles. You want to make sure that managers hold people accountable, so use a sort of coaching style when we're doing our one-to-ones or our check-ins. And actually, you could get the individual to drive any of these meetings. It doesn't have to be manager-led. You can get the individual to drive it. Remember that point that if you are using ratings, development ratings and performance ratings, they're better separate. And if you notice, that's what we've done on this. So the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock is all about development and engagement. And the 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock is about performance. So what that means is you can tick quite a number of when we said, what's the purpose, a number of purposes within this by using this kind of model, because you're actually trying to look at engagement and performance in this process. If you are using something like ratings, then make sure calibration takes place, and maybe you might need support if that's something you're moving to make sure it's done well. I've found that actually putting in place a calibration or moderation process is really educational for line managers. And if you, for example, you were looking to put performance related pay in for the first time, it's really good practice to do a dry run the first year where things are not linked, where you can actually get managers to see whether they are rating in a fair and equivalent way. Kate's got a question here about what are people's thoughts on the feed forward approach about looking at future performance and behaviours? AstraZeneca, I'm not sure. I've heard feed forward. I'm not sure. If you can you write any more, Kate, about what that is or how that works? That would be great. And make sure that you've got transparency around things. People, that is actually quite one of the things that drives high performance or doesn't. If people feel that decisions on pay, for example, are done in a darkened room, they can have no impact on them, and it's, you know, it's a bit, yeah, it's done. It's nothing to do with them. They're not sure how transparent it is. Then that's actually demotivational. So, and by the way, I'm not advocating performance related pay necessarily. It's actually quite a tricky thing to manage, but it needs to be clear and transparent and well communicated if that is something that you're doing. Anyone got thoughts on the feed forward approach about that? Looking at future performance and behaviours. So, people saying you did X, so great if you can. Okay, yes. Well, yeah, I mean, that is a having a coaching style. That's another one. When we on this research paper we'll send out with you, that is another one of the things that makes a difference to performance. So definitely, I would say that's good practice. So identify what someone's done, and it would be even better if you can do this. I was running a how to manage underperformance webinar yesterday, and for me, that's absolutely how you prevent underperformance. If you are having that really honest conversation about this is what worked, and you know, the even better if, I think it's the squiggly careers ladies like that in terms of the feedback. This was really good, and next time it would be even better if you do this with bells on. And that's actually constructive feedback, saying something that they could do differently, but it doesn't come over negatively. You're kind of stretching people forwards. So I think that is a really good style to encourage. And again, something that some managers might do really well, but actually probably people need educating and training on. And that's another thing. So if you are rolling out something new in your organization, or even just rebranding what you're doing, be really clear in the communication of what the expectations are. So when we're working with new customers, we'll say, okay, so what's your annual expectations? Are you going to do a 4-point or a 2-point? What is it? And do people know when they need to have done things by and why this is important? Giving them the whole thing. So why, what's the purpose of this? It's about engagement, it's about retention, whatever it might be, and helping people to really understand what's expected. Because if you tell people clearly that you expect them to have done X number of one-to-ones by Y date, then you're going to get much better results from people, because I guess you're setting the parameters with people as to what good performance means in terms of line managers. Yeah, you'll get, Gemma, don't worry, I saw you just joined in. We will send you the link and you'll get the video, you'll get it from the start. I will come back to Becky, your question there. I just thought something which was relevant to that, but it's gone out of my head now, because then in terms of that, but I'll look at the questions. Yes, all right, it's gone. So let's have a quick look. I'll come back to yours, Becky. Yours there. Lisa agrees with calibration of performance ratings. Yeah, yes, that is so you've done calibration meetings. It's so educational for line managers, where they realize, oh my goodness, I'm really overrating or underrating. So that's really quite a valuable a sort of a moderation process. And you often, as an HR person, needs to sort of facilitate that. Oh, sorry, at the end of, I'm afraid, Gemma, it was internal for a customer. But I have got content, we've got loads of underperformance content that we can send. Well, HR uprising links I've done on it, and I've got some white papers on that sort of thing as well. I do it as an in-house training for people. Right, Becky. And maybe I should do a webinar. I probably have done a webinar on it, actually. We'll look through the back catalogue. I'm hoping that Hannah, my colleague, and Katie in the background will be searching. Thank you. So we'll send any links that are relevant to you, because we've got you. We'll send those out afterwards. So Becky's saying, I'm struggling to align this cycle to our organisational budget cycles, including training budgets, salary review, etc. Okay, so what you can give us more information if you want, but certainly what I'd say in terms of most organisations that do link to performance, you need to align it sufficiently, or you need to have an end point of your, let's say it's April to April for argument's sake, usually what you want to do is align salary review. If you are going to do performance related pay, salary review can't be immediate. It's got to be 2 or 3 months afterwards if you're going to do calibration. So the organisation I used to work for, let's say it was April to March, then salary review would kick in probably in April, May, probably May, June, because you need to have that, you need to have got everyone to have done their appraisals, put their ratings in, and then do the calibration and then apply the thing. So you need a 2 or 3 month lag for the pay review to kick in. In terms of your training budgets, again, well, budgeting tends to happen, doesn't it? Usually before the start of the financial year. So your training budget is your training budget probably, but what I'd say is this is how you allocate your training budget is in line with the training needs. And I guess what you can do if you can't meet all of the training needs, you can then ask for future training budget. You get to real-time things. So you kind of end, well, that's what I used to end up with. I've got what I've got. How do I distribute what I've got? And I guess if you had a real burning business need, you could go, the difference here is actually, rather than just being reactive and giving people training, you can go and say, look, we've got a business need here for XYZ training. I can see all these people are asking for it. It's linked to company performance because they're saying they need it in order to achieve their objectives. So you could argue it should be more self-funding. And maybe this gives you the tools for a business case to get discretionary budget for training. That's just thoughts off the top of my head there, Becky. I hope that's a little bit useful. School difficult. Oh yes, right. So we work with a lot of universities, Kate, and we do that, and they have 3 check-ins. What they do is they combine the career aspiration and development check-in in those organisations where they do that. So yeah, that's seems to work for them. So hopefully it sounds like you're already doing that. Great. So you're just about to create the meeting 3, which is the engagement one. So I guess my tips would be merge them together. Don't go too heavy on performance. Make it really light touch about achievement language. What development have they got? Also, again, you've got hardly any budget in schools, have you? So training doesn't have to be formal training. That whole thing about who else can help you or how could you learn within, almost encouraging people to coach each other, to think about how can we learn from each other. So you could formalize things like that in there, or yes, so you don't have to pay extra, but people still feel they're learning. What have you learned this year on job? Self-coaching questions. So my tip would be make it sort of prompting the coaching questions, because not all line managers will think of them, and gear it like that, and maybe even giving people examples of how they could do on the job learning, or can we do a lunch and learn, or a share information at a team meeting. So the development that people are getting, they can see that it doesn't have to cost money. They're getting development. Obviously that value to everybody, but that's how you can do it. Okie doke. So if there's any other questions or anyone doesn't want to put them in the chat, they want to say, what I'll do is I'm going to just wrap up here, mention a few other things, what's coming up. So our next webinar is about developing a culture of learning. We've then got topics on talent management, and if you want to do something like 360 feedback, practical steps, how you could run a 360 feedback process, which actually is also something that's really a great thing from a development point of view and doesn't have to be high cost if you want to run it in-house. Also to mention Type Coach. This is a new personality tool that I really like, because I've loved personality tools, frankly, but it's a bit different because it's more about applied personality. So it's similar to Myers-Briggs in that you've got type language, but you get a tool which actually goes, right, you're this type, how do you influence or communicate with that type? Great for line managers, great for people in sales. If you want to find out more about it, then I'm doing an open demo type thing next week, as it happens, isn't it? I think, yeah, next week or the week after. So feel free to sign up to that if you'd like to know more about it. And if you're not already, it'd be great if you could follow us on our socials, like, share, etc. That would be appreciated. I can see another question just coming in. Reviews for manufacturing organisations. So if anybody else wants to drop off, if this isn't of interest, feel free to drop off, and thank you for joining. We will send you links, etc. Kate, thoughts on reviews for manufacturing? What I know about manufacturing is, again, we've got manufacturing organisations, quite difficult in terms of IT. They sometimes do group reviews. I'm not sure whether that's ideal or not, but they sometimes set group objectives and do group reviews. You definitely want it to be very light touch, in terms of really simple forms, simple conversation with those. And yeah, so with our manufacturing organisations, they tend to have like a very straightforward appraisal, and actually they may well have it less frequently. Again, it's almost like you've got slightly different purpose for people who are on shifts and those sort of things. The level of engagement that they are actually going to have with career aspirations. I mean, I'm not they may want to. If they have, then they should get the opportunity. But I suppose the key is just thinking, what is the purpose of the appraisal for these particular individuals? Often what you've got with manufacturing things is there's certain things that are zero harm. You've got to make sure the focus is appropriate to their role. They often tend to be working to really strict KPIs, etc. But it depends on how much autonomy they've got as an individual as opposed to a group. So that's not really a clear answer, Kate, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is there may be a different purpose of the appraisal for those staff than there is for people in more operational roles, and don't be scared to give them a slightly different timetable that's going to work. In terms of that, in terms of availability of managers in IT compared to people in more operational roles, you might have slightly different purposes to those. And actually, again, another plug, if you use a system, you can have completely different forms. If you use paper, you can have completely different forms, but certainly make it horses for courses, even within your organization. Be realistic about what they're going to do and make it sort of short and high level is my suggestion. So feel free, thank you very much for joining, everybody. What I'm going to do is I'll stop the webinar now, but if anybody, and I'll start the recording, we'll send all these things out to you, but if anybody wants to stop and chat, feel free to stay on, and I'm happy to have a quick chat.